As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I was introduced to Andrea Firth in 2022 through our mutual colleague, Allison K. Williams. A few months after this introduction, we met at the Hippocamp Literary Conference, and we've been in touch ever since. Andrea is one of the editors at the Brevity Blog and co-founder of Diablo Writers Workshop, where she teaches creative writing and provides developmental editing. She has an MFA in creative nonfiction from St. Mary's College of California. She was a finalist for the Missouri Review's 2021 Perkoff Prize in Nonfiction, and her work has appeared in Dorothy Parker's Ashes, Allium, and the Coachella Review, among others. During our interview, we took a deep dive into resilient editing, the difference between the essay and memoir, and what the Brevity Blog is looking for. Before we get to our conversation, I have a couple of questions for you. What small moments in your life beg to be written about? What kinds of feedback inspires you to continue? What feedback deflates you? And what might you have to say about the writing life that could benefit others? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now, let's get to my conversation with Andrea Firth. Hey writers, have you struggled to develop characters beyond a laundry list of physical traits, or do you fall into the tired cliches of stomachs that roil and boil, hearts that pound, and characters that look off into the distance, unsure what to do? Has a critique partner ever told you your character's motivations or actions don't make sense? Or worse, has an agent told you they just don't connect with your main character? Let's face it, developing great characters is hard work. It takes both artistry and an understanding of psychology to bring them to life and make their actions understandable. It's even harder when that character you're trying to describe is you. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to teach the psychology of character development for memoirists on June 19th, 2024. During this 90-minute webinar, you'll discover the three-step chain of events that determines what your character does in any situation, investigate the role that core wounds, attachment styles, and inner resources play in shaping your character's personality, and find out how having your character act as if can help you limit backstory and start in the right place. Plus, you're going to learn so much more. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. You heard that right, $25. For that price, you can attend the live webinar, watch the recording, or do both, and get access to the webinar's workbook and my slides. So if you want to understand yourself better, write characters readers will fall in love with, and feel confident that you know how to do more than just craft tired cliches, go to janefriedman.com and click on paid classes, or make it easy on yourself and click on the link in the show notes. Well, hello, Andrea. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so happy to have you on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here too.
So you are a person who wears many hats. You work for Diablo Writers, you're an editor for the Brevity Blog, you do all these things. What would you like us to know about you, including about you as an essayist?
Well, so first and foremost, I'm a writer and mostly essay, but I worked as a journalist for several years. So I still like to do interviews and write research and reported articles too. 7 years ago, I co-founded Diablo Writers Workshop, which has been a big part of what I do. It's a space for adult writers to work on creative writing. And I teach classes there. I do developmental editing and support what's really become a vibrant writing community. And we have other events. We host a weekly co-writing that's free. And I host a monthly session, again, free, where we work on submitting our writing to literary journals. And then I'm an editor for the blog, which I just love. And I spend a fair amount of time on that volunteer gig.
Well, first, I bow to you for all of the hard work you put into the volunteer work. That is always a lot, and it is such great service to our community as, writers. And I also want to say, I know people who participate in Diablo Writers, and they're always telling me how great it is. So you have so many things that you do really well, and so many gifts that you're offering to the writing community that people should be checking out. And by the way, in case you're like, how could I check these out? Those of you who are listening, all of that will be in the show notes so that you have access to all of that. But I want to talk about essays for a second because you see yourself primarily as an essayist. I was reading some of your beautiful essays in Dorothy Parker's Ashes. The most recent one is Secret Words. And what I love about your work is that it's so nuanced, right? So you take a simple thing like a dad giving you a secret word, or another essay that I read is about a broken window. And you take us through all of these layers of what this can be. And you always end on this like slightly unresolved note. You never do this thing which no essayist should really do, which is like, dear Rita, and here is the lesson I'd like you to learn. You have this beautiful way of pulling back and making us have a question, which I love. What would you like to say about essays and how they're doing a work that is different from, say, memoir?
Great question, and thank you for the kind words about my work. And yes, you don't want an ending of an essay to wrap it up in a bow, and the moral of the story is. So I think the difference between memoir and personal essay comes down to topic in a way.
Mm,
Both genres or subgenres of creative nonfiction explore our lived experience. Personal essay is a very flexible and creative form that aims to find meaning in what we encounter and contemplate in the everyday. I'm going to paraphrase Philip Lopate, a leader in the field of essay early on, and he says it's the essay's taste for littleness,
mm,
the small and humble things in life, which is the essay's strong suit. So an essay can take on any topic, anything, like a moth, just to give a nod to Virginia
mm-hmm,
Woolf, and turn that into a meditational adventure. And I once wrote an essay about my kids' pet hermit crabs, but ultimately it was about much more than that. So whereas memoir will cover a period of time in a writer's life, essay can be a momentary slice of life. And essays always experimented with form and structure, which is one of the things I love about it. The other thing is one of the requirements of essay for an essay to work is that the writer by the end has a recognition or a realization.
mm.
Sometimes it's an epiphany and a big thing, but often it's much more subtle than that, but it can be significant. So I think that might be what you were pointing to, that in the close, me as the writer and narrator, I've learned something about myself in the wider world, but it's not necessarily like hugely life-changing. It's all these little events layered upon each other accumulate to. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. So, some things that I hear, with memoir, it's often like, let me take you through this big thing that has happened to me in my life. And I'm going to take you along this adventure. And you can interpret the word adventure in any way you like. But the essay is about taking the small moment, blowing it up in a sense, so we can look at it from multiple angles and figure out what is the personal epiphany? Like, what is it that I've learned about my life that's not necessarily earth shattering, though sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. A James Baldwin quote I use a lot around essay versus like, this is essay versus play, but I also talk about this in terms of memoir is that when you are writing fiction or plays or memoir, you're trying to show something. But when it comes to essay, there's an argument involved and you're trying to convince somebody of something. So you're thinking about what is the idea I'm exploring? What is the argument that I am taking someone through, even though it may not look like an argument when you're reading it, especially in personal essay. What do you think about that?
Yeah, an argument and or the writer, the narrator is trying to answer a question.
Yeah.
I look at essay and the aboutness, what it's about on there's two layers to it. There's what it's about on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Pet hermit crabs my kids have. But then as you continue to write and you start to identify themes in the essay and that what's bubbling up, like in that essay, what it really it was it ended up being a braided essay, the story about the kids and the hermit crabs, and then a neighbor that I had who was a recluse and never came out.
Mm.
And it braided and it really became about the meaning of home. And then, hermit crabs and how they trade their shells, that became a metaphor and a touchstone. And I was trying to explore what this neighbor meant to me and what his life, his very secluded life meant.
Mm.
And it gave me that a vehicle, a place to explore that. And I think just like when you start a novel or a memoir and you don't really know how it's going to end, very often with essay, I think writers, we don't know what we're writing about when we start. And you have to write through it to get there, to get to that place where the aboutness on the surface
Yeah.
and bubbling up meets, because that's the heart of the essay.
Okay, so I have not yet read this essay, but I want to now, and I want everyone else to be able to. So please be sure to send me this by email so that I can add this to the show notes because it sounds like a fascinating essay. And as you think about it, you know that there was a steeper layer about your relationship with this neighbor. As you're thinking back on that writing process, and also know that I have no idea is a fine answer to any question. What do you think the inciting incident was? What was it that called you to write this?
So it's going to sound a little strange, but we were in Florida, hermit crab races. We ended up flying back to Chicago, myself, two kids, my husband, with two brand new hermit crab pets. And my kids were maybe four, 4 or 5. And they, one hermit crab had a red mark on it, one had a blue mark on it. So each child knew which hermit crab was theirs. I'm having coffee one morning and blue hermit crab attacks red hermit crab, pulls the hermit crab body out of the shell,
No.
and then goes and takes over the shell.
Oh my goodness.
Because this is the world of hermit crabs. It's a dog eat dog world. But there's always competition for shells. We actually had put other empty shells in the cage, but whatever. So then when my children came home from school, I had the task of trying to explain to two 4-year-olds whose hermit crab was still around.
Oh no.
It was quite a funny conversation because they knew blue and red and they had named them and it kind of went on for a while. So I started with that, this kind of silly little story about hermit crabs and kind of what happens in nature. And then as I kind of dug into that and thought through that a little bit more about someone coming in and taking someone else's home, the recluse, we lived in quite a nice neighborhood and he hadn't done anything to his house in decades. And
Mm-hmm.
everyone thought it was an eyesore. And people used to put notes on his door, like, because it was a nice neighborhood, like, hey, I could give you a good offer, buy your house. And I was quite protective of him because I had gotten friendly with him over the years. So all those things started to collide. So the inciting incidents was a hermit crab incident. And then it just seemed, as I wrote into it, I think what the writer needs to do in essay is start to consider how it connects with the wider world.
I love that. So all of that happened when your kids were small. How much time passed between that incident and you deciding to write about it?
So that essay I wrote, well, actually, time did pass because I wrote that essay when I was in grad school.
Mm.
A bit of time had passed. I went off to grad school when my kids graduated from high school. So a good 10, 12 years. But that story had, we have these stories from our past that percolate inside of us. And I think the experience we had at that point, we had moved away and left old John, is how I referred to my neighbor. And I think he had passed away. And I think
Mm.
that triggered the whole thing, that me thinking about John again and the hermit crabs, and then it all came together.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is that, when we're thinking about essay, sometimes we feel this desire to talk about what's happening right now, especially if you're trying to publish, say, for a larger venue, like, making something timely. But often, like, looking at the past can be a really helpful way to think about this work because you have that distance. And you recently had a quote on your Instagram from this beautiful poem by Natalie Diaz that you said created this prompt in your mind around writing about the wound. And so I think there's a way that we can write about the wound, and that experience may not necessarily have a wound, but there's a charge there, right? There's something that we're still trying to explore, and that can be a great way to do it.
Yeah, I often with teaching and then with myself derive prompts from what I read. So I'll read about something, I'll read a published essay, a poem, and then share that, and then whatever that the core of that poem or
Hmm.
is, I'll say, write about a wound, or it could be something more basic. Write about a department store because the story was about a department store. I just used that prompt the other day. We did an icebreaker, and I said, tell me a department store or a mall or some sort of shopping experience from when you were young. And we went around. And then I said, the prompt was, write about something that's from your childhood that's disappearing, because department stores are disappearing.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, so you could write about it specifically about your department store experience or something else that's disappearing. So I think prompts can really motivate us to pull from our past and bring it forward.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a really nice frame for what prompts can do, because sometimes people feel like prompts are useless. Like, oh, you're getting me to talk about this random thing. And like, people either love prompts or they hate prompts. But this is like a gorgeous way that you can take a prompt and make it really relevant. And speaking of prompts and students, you teach. We're talking today about resilient editing. And I think the only way we can get to the resilient part is by talking about some of the problems that people sometimes have. And so I also work as an editor. I also teach. And so I'm pretty well versed in the kinds of issues my students face. I'm curious to know, what common struggles do you see with your writers that you work with?
Well, so I primarily teach creative nonfiction, essay, memoir. And I think what students struggle with is a lot of what we just talked about is aboutness. Like,
Yes.
it's about. And it's that movement from here, this happened to me. I want to tell you,
Mm-hmm.
like, I just went to see the eclipse. I want to tell people about that experience. A lot of people went to see the eclipse. So it's taking that the next step, moving from what it's about on the surface, and then how does that connect to the wider world, and how do the themes, like you have to kind of dig deeper and then start looking for meaning and connection. So even small, humble things like pet hermit crabs can go deeper into an exploration of what is home. But I think what that requires of writers is time. And I think that they need to sit with it more, write in different directions, look through different lenses to find those connections. Another thing that I find common with writers when I edit, even when I'm working with friends and peers, it's clarity.
Mm-hmm.
That writers get ahead of what they put on the page, and they can lose or confuse the reader. And again, it happens in early drafts. The solution to that is to step away, to give it some time, to read it aloud. And then those missing bits and the unclear sections become more apparent. You can get that identified to you with someone else reading it in a workshop with an editor, but I actually think there's a lot that we can do as writers
Yes.
ourselves in revision. And I see it on the blog that a submission comes in and there's a lot of potential, but there are unclear sections. People get excited and they want to get it in, and it's an early draft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that. And I would, want to echo what you're saying about aboutness, because I think that is a struggle that I see people have a lot. And I recently interviewed Sue William Silverman, and we were talking about, writing. And one of the things she said is like, creative nonfiction is not a Xeroxing of your life. You're not
Right.
just saying this happened and that happened. You have to find out what it means. And I see writers struggle with this all the time. And I think the more fraught the experience is, sometimes the bigger the challenge is in terms of figuring out that aboutness, largely because it's tangled up with all of the feelings, right? So it's like, I want to express those feelings. And you do have to Xerox your life, on the page in early drafts. But it takes a while to get there. And sometimes when you don't have that sense of aboutness, I think that also muddies the clarity.
Oh yeah, yeah. And that's again, that's one of the reasons I really love the essay form, because you don't have to have some torrid, tumultuous event. It really can be pet hermit crabs. I had written an essay, secret words. That was a fun little game. My father made up a couple secret words for me when I was 5. But then that essay goes into some of the deeper, more difficult
Mm-hmm.
of, my childhood. But I didn't start with them.
Yeah. I love that idea of not starting necessarily with whatever the wound is, but maybe starting with something that makes you curious. And then, if the wound is going to be connected, it will find a way in because I've talked about this with people before. This was something I learned in graduate school back when I was getting a degree in learning and behavior disorders. I had this excellent developmental psychology professor. And one of the things she said is that when the limbic system is overtaxed, learning cannot occur. So, like your limbic system is the part of your brain that handles fight or flight. So if you are in a highly emotionally activated state, you actually can't learn. So finding things that are of a lower charge for yourself that you can use to practice the craft of writing is actually going to make you a better writer so that when you deal with these more challenging experiences, you have more skills to work with.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things, because I started in journalism, I was writing about other people.
Yeah.
So I had that distance. I could write about their problems or, what was going on. And it also gave me distance because, at literary journalism, people got into incorporating their own personal experience. But I did a lot of straight feature writing, but I wasn't in the story. So
Mm-hmm.
that had been how I had learned. And so for me, I actually had the experience when I moved to creative writing and I went to grad school was like kind of opening up. And I've always been described as that I write with restraint. And I think there's good and bad things to that because you do really ultimately want to get your story out on the page. I've had to work at that. Yeah, it's something, and I'm always impressed by the writers that really spill it out, but you do need to find a balance.
Yes, absolutely. And I've worked with many a journalist in recovery, as I call them sometimes, when it comes to creative nonfiction, because it is a common challenge if you have worked in journalism and you have completely walled yourself off from the story because that's what was required for that genre. To then insert yourself can feel taboo,
Right, right.
like you're breaking some fundamental rule.
Yeah. And I do tend to, not every essay, but I do like the braided form because I can have a section that's my story and then the next section might be researched or,
Mm-hmm.
I could tell my pet hermit crab story, my time with my kids. And then I can talk about John and how difficult that was and what was going on culturally and
Mm-hmm.
the 90s and all the money and the houses and real estate. And then I could go back to the story of my kids. So sometimes structure can help you with that too.
Yeah, and I love what I hear in that also is that the braided narrative is a structure where you have two separate stories and you're weaving them together. And the way you weave them together creates the super story, like something else that you couldn't say otherwise. But that there's a way that in the braiding, you create relief. So you can have emotional charge and then remove to something that, is lighter and then kind of juxtaposing those two kinds of writing.
Yeah, now, maybe we can throw this into the show notes for the folks that are interested in braided essay. Lily Danziger did an essay for the Brevity blog about writing a braided essay. So the one story was, this is how a braided essay happens. The other story is it happens to be about the eclipse, but it gets into some deeper, darker personal things. So
Mm-hmm.
that juxtaposition is so well done. And then on top of it, you leave knowing how to write a braided essay. It's just brilliant.
I will definitely add that to the show notes. And shout out to Lily Danziger because she is a fantastic writer and essayist. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. And it's also so timely since we're recording this the week after the eclipse happened. And we were both in the path of totality down in Texas.
Yeah. Really great experience. I would say once in a lifetime, but since the cloud cover came in just after totality and neither of us were able to see the moon retreat out the other side, I may have to chase that again, even if I have to wait till, what is it, 2044, the next time it crosses the US, because it's going to cross right over San Francisco where I live.
Very cool. Well, I may be there with you.
Well, I'll be a little old dear by then. I'll be 82, but hopefully I'll still be kicking.
I'm sure you will be with all because you're a swimmer. So you do all of the swimming and you are very physically fit. And what I would say is I'm also thinking of going to another eclipse because we had some cloud cover. I feel like I cheated because I had perfect view of totality in 2017. Like I saw all of it like for the whole time. And like my goal with this one was like, I want to see it longer. Like I wanted more. And of course I got shorter, which is the irony of like, chasing celestial events and weather. But yeah, so I mean, I think there's a story in there for both of us. I definitely agree there. And also that makes me think about, there's the structure and there's these early essays. And I want to get into thinking about resilient editing. Like how can we as coaches or editors support resilient editing? And also, how can writers tap into that resilience as they're working on their own work? Because just as you said, there is so much that the writer can do themselves. But before we get into that conversation on resilient editing, I have a question for you that's how many drafts on average do you think an essay that you're writing goes through?
Well, I'm a big reviser. I'm a big reviser. And I think essays, especially the ones that I'm putting out into literary magazines, it's not uncommon for an essay to take a year. I don't want to scare people, but 30 or 40.
That is a great answer. And it aligns with what some other people have said. And I would say, I tell people this all the time, like depending on what I'm doing, it could be a minimum of 10 drafts. Minimum, but often 20 or 30 drafts is common. And I think it's really important for new writers to hear more established writers share this because it also, for some people, it can be really scary. Like, oh my gosh, you mean I'm going to have to write this again and again? But it also normalizes that process and it can make you feel a little better about the fact that, yeah, you're not going to get it on the first draft or the first few drafts because you're not supposed to.
Yeah. And I mean, the drafts toward the end, it can be minor changes where you're
Exactly.
language and you're really, really refining and looking at every word. But I think quite easily up to 10 to really get the bones of it down.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a metaphor that it's there, that it's in place, the structure's defined, the beginning, the middle, the end, easily 10.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I don't know about you, but most of the essays I write, I don't know the aboutness. Like, I
Exactly.
struggle as much as anyone else with the aboutness. I have this essay I'm working on right now. I was going for a walk this morning, like, what is the aboutness? What is the aboutness? And I've been working on this essay for about a year, like, and it's close. And I think I'm almost there, but I just keep having to meditate on it.
It'll happen in my sleep. Sometimes I get up and write it down, not always, but hopefully it comes back to me in the morning or on walks in the pool over the course of several months where like I'll be like, oh. And then one other thing is one of the things that I do when I'm editing or if I'm in a workshop is we'll start with in a workshop and I'll start with editorial feedback. What is this about? And then what else is it about deeper? And often because we as the writer we might not know, that kind of feedback can be quite useful. Like I don't tell people this is what you're intending to write about. When I read, this is what I'm taking away. And sometimes the writer on the other side is like, oh, I didn't even know I was writing about that. And it can be really enlightening. So, sharing your work can help you with that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to share a tip that I heard from someone else, and I cannot remember who I heard this from, but someone was saying that if you write a question on a piece of paper and put it under your pillow before you go to sleep, this can be a way to get your question answered by morning. Like that can be something that happens. So if you don't know the aboutness of your essay, write a question about it, stick it underneath your pillow, or do what Andrea has said, which is get feedback from other people. Because I agree, there are so many things that we're blind to when we are working on our own writing.
Yeah, and ask for the feedback. Be specific what themes you're seeing and where the deeper aboutness. Like have whoever you ask to read answer your question specifically, because otherwise, they could give you good feedback, but it could be going in different directions.
Yes, I think that's really important. And you and I were talking about some of the languaging we use when it comes to editing other people's work or working as a teacher. Like I use the word invitation, you have a different word, which I'll allow you to share in a second. But it's like keeping it open ended and really reflecting things back to the writer so that the writer can say yes or no versus feeling like we have told them what it is.
Right, right. Well, you mentioned resilient editing, and I love that phrase and that concept. So one of the things with feedback and editing, I think it's really important to start with highlights of the piece.
Mm-hmm.
What's lighting up on the page? Where is their writing craft at work? And I think you will always, we want to support ourselves and other writers from the start. Um,
Yes.
and so in workshops, I usually have a writer read an excerpt of the piece that we've already read so we can hear it in the writer's voice and so that they have ownership from the start. It's just a nice way to on-ramp. And then the next thing we do, and in an editorial letter, I do it through writing, but in workshop, we give a round of applause because it's hard to write and it's, taking that next step to then share your work. That can be a little bit scary. And then we move to highlights. And I do this as an editor, but in workshop, I think it's essential to be very specific.
Yes.
People in the audience, the peers, point to the passage on the page, say what the writing craft is, because that kind of feedback, that specific feedback about what's working, that that lifts the writer up. That encourages them, that gives them confidence, that shows that they're competent. And it's more valuable than saying, hey, I just love the whole thing. It really doesn't help the writer move forward. And then as far as invitations, the word I use next after we've gone over highlights is opportunities. As a developmental editor, I'm more prescriptive. That's my job. But I still, like you, I always say, I'm one reader. And I'm offering these thoughts to you as opportunities, but this will be your choice to make because it's your piece. You're the writer. And again, I try and give the feedback within the framework of craft. So you're giving the writer like a map, a guide.
Yes.
You know, this line worked great. I'm just wondering what it would, could repetition be an opportunity here? And not tell them how to do it, not write it, but try and give them options.
Absolutely. I think having some guideposts around what you can do, how you can do it is really helpful. And I love that you start with what's going well because writers can learn as much from what's going well as they can from constructive feedback. A lot of writers be like, well, just tell me what's wrong, and or sometimes they don't want you to tell them what's wrong. They want to know that it's brilliant, which is never one or the other. But learning what you do well so you can capitalize on it and do it again. I think that's one of the things about that specificity that's important is when you know specifically what went well, you can replicate it, which is more helpful than like, oh, I love this. And I think the same with the invitations. And for me personally, I love it when I offer an invitation or a question or I say like, here's what I'm seeing. Does this align with what you're seeing? And they say to me, no, not that. But what you said made me think about this. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm like, yes, push against the invitation.
Very good. One example is identifying in a piece, like, I really felt things started to heat up and happen when you moved in scene here.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's an opportunity to start the piece here. Because
Yes.
it started with the positive that the writer can accept and be happy about. Like, yeah, the craft is working here. So then the suggested opportunity makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I often ask people, especially if I'm doing like a workshop, where does it come alive?
Yeah.
Because that's the place with a lot of energy and charge and we are invested. And what a lot of new writers need to understand about writing, and I think more established writers get this, is that there's a lot of throat clearing we have to do. And often those first few pages or first few paragraphs are very necessary for us to write because they help us get to the point where things come alive. And then it's in that revision process, you can just lop it off.
Right, right. That's what I always say about beginnings is when you're writing, just begin anywhere
Mm-hmm.
because that's the beauty of word processing. And when I'm writing myself, I keep everything, even as I start cutting things out, I just throw it at the bottom of the document. I have this line, and I just start throwing things down there. And then as I get through the draft, I can go back, and they might get moved back up, but I don't lose anything. I think cutting words and putting them in the trash is a hard thing to do, so I don't do it.
No, it's so important to keep that. And what I do is like I save every single draft. I have like version 1, version 2, version 20. Because sometimes what I'll find is that the thing that I had in drafts 1 through 3 that didn't work in an early draft, sometimes I go, "Oh, it was important. I needed to have it. It's just I didn't know the work it needed to do. So then I have to like, bring it back."
Yeah. Or for me, sometimes I find that it's going to come out in a different essay.
Exactly.
I have a
Yes.
folder on my desktop for, my darlings, and they go into the darlings folder, and hopefully they have another life.
I love that. I love that you have a repurposing of the darlings. That's so important because that's one of the things we really struggle with is like, oh, I worked so hard on this thing and I don't want to get rid of it because of the effort, but you have a place for the effort
Yeah.
and, a way for it to be resurrected. So I want to shift gears to the Brevity blog because you also work as an editor for the Brevity blog. And what would you like us to know about Brevity blog essays, which are very specific?
Right. So the number one thing to know about Brevity Blog, it's a place to discuss issues related to creative nonfiction,
Hmm.
specific focus. That says, topically, we cover a really wide range. It could be craft, it could be writing process, editing, publishing, book launch, revision, writing life. So as long as it connects to creative nonfiction, many topics are likely a fit. We're not a journal, but we're not like what the early days of a blog were. I think our blog guidelines do a pretty good job of explaining what we're looking for. And I set them aside. I'm just going to read a couple sentences. We aim to publish not just blog posts, but essays with a beginning, a middle, and an ending, with the arc and movement found in all good essays, as I paraphrased, in which the writer comes to a recognition, a realization, and sometimes an epiphany. We look for that through line and a reader takeaway that questions, teaches, inspires, and or entertains us, that makes us think, which you and I have just been talking about.
Hmm.
So the idea is that when someone reads the blog, say they read it in the morning, we publish every weekday, that they leave with, something that's going to add to their writing life that day.
Yes.
We're all writers. We have different experiences, but they connect in myriad ways so that they've got a takeaway that they can bring forward. So that's a big thing about the blog. And I think the way to get familiar, just like any lit mag, is to read it. You can get it, it's free. You can get it to your inbox each day, or you can go explore the archives. And then one other thing we have in the guidelines that I think is pretty helpful is we link to an essay that we, the editors, published, I think last summer. And in that essay, we broke down, these are the things that work in blog essays, and these are the things that don't work.
Hmm.
We have 6 or 7 examples that we link to of essays of a real variety that we think are working. So we're absolutely proud of every essay we publish, and these are 6 examples, but I think that can be a really helpful resource.
Yeah, I love how you said that. Like, read the blog so you can familiarize yourself with what they are publishing, what they're looking for, what's already been published, so that you're not pitching something that, was recently talked about. I think that's really important. And the great thing about the Brevity blog is the word brevity. They're all short. And so, what is the average word count?
So the sweet spot, as we describe it, is 850 words,
Mm-hmm.
minimum of 500 words, and no more than 1,000. But I would say most of the essays fall between 750 and 850 words, and we'll help the writer edit it to achieve that as well. And one other thing about the blog, where we do differ from a journal, and we can't do this all the time, we're all volunteers and we get a lot of submissions, but we will work with writers to get an essay ready for the blog. So
Mm-hmm.
if the essay has potential, if it's got a through line and there looks like there's a takeaway, but there's some clarity issues or things could get improved, I'll go back and forth several times with the writer. I really encourage people to submit because we love to work with writers.
So here's some things I'm going to say on behalf of Andrea and all of the rest of the editorial staff. When you hear maximum of 1,000, I want you to think about that sweet spot. Try to get as close to 850 or below as you can, because I think sometimes readers think like, oh, well, the upper end means I can submit something that's 1,000 words and then they'll help me pare it back. Remember, these people are all volunteers and they do not necessarily have the time, even though Andrea just said, we will work with writers, especially if there's a lot of potential in the piece. So really think about that sweet spot, because every journal has a sweet spot, and the closer you can get to whatever that sweet spot is, the better your chances are. The other thing I will say is I love how generous you are, Andrea, and that you are willing to work with writers, especially if there's potential. Here's what I want you all not to hear. I can send Andrea a hot mess of things that I think has a point in it, and Andrea will help me find that point. You should think as best you can about the point, what the point is, and take your work as far as possible. And for you, it should feel complete. And maybe there might be some things that need to be edited or fixed, and Andrea will find that, and Andrea will, help you shape it. But I know sometimes writers will hear things like this and they'll think, oh, I can send early work. So those of you who are not watching this, Andrea just did a good head shake. Okay. So I'm going to let you say something about that, because yeah, I think I want them to hear exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, maybe I thank you for qualifying. One, we talked about it before, like where do writers struggle? And I see it on the blog is they submit an early draft.
Mm-hmm.
Probably get a more standard response
Yeah.
because we don't have the time just to clean work up. And you need a clear, just like with the guidelines I read, you need a clear takeaway. You need a through line. That's what we're asking you for. So yeah, submit your best.
Submit your best and read those 6 essays that they have linked to, and continue to read, because as you read additional essays that are published, an essay might inspire you to write something else, because you might say, oh my gosh, this makes me think about this other thing, and I'm pretty sure that will work. So that's another great takeaway.
And a really great example that hopefully I know Lisa will put into the show notes as well is Lisa's most recent publication you've published on the blog, but your most recent essay about your experience at AWP, and it's got a very catchy title. I encourage everyone to read that, lived experience and, a writer having a recognition, a realization, an epiphany. It's really well done.
Oh, well, thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate that. And I will link that so that people can read it. And yeah, I really thought about what that takeaway was. It wasn't just the experience, like the situation at AWP was a launching point. I think that's another way to think about essays sometimes, is like that initial situation. You're like, oh, this is really juicy. This has energy. Sometimes that's the launching point, not the destination. And that was certainly the case for me.
Yeah, great. We do one other note on Brevity Blog is a lot of blog essays are craft oriented. Brevity, the magazine, is like our big sister.
Mm-hmm.
Brevity used to publish craft essays, not academic craft essays, but like beautifully crafted craft essays by people like Beth Kephart and other great writers.
Yes.
The craft essay part of Brevity is now been folded into the blog for a couple of good reasons, and it's more opportunities for these craft essays to get published. So writers can keep that in mind. You couldn't be writing about personal experience, and our craft essays often incorporate personal experience. But if you have a teaching background or you've done a close read on some other piece of writing and you want to put together a craft essay, we now publish those on the blog as well. Not that we kind of always
Mm.
have, but I'm just saying we've rolled over what was on Brevity into the blog.
I love that. So yeah, so if you're a teacher, you should be looking and look for craft essays and see, what has been explored. And I think that post by Lily Danziger sounds like a great one. That's kind of a hybrid. I mean, I've got all of the stuff in it, so that will be really great for people to look at. And then there are tons of others on there. So if people want to connect with you, learn more about you, think about the blog, because we could talk forever, but life has to go on and the podcast episode has to end. What are the best ways for people to connect with you and also connect with Brevity if they want to make a submission?
Great. So in the show notes, you'll put the website for Brevity Blog. We don't use Submittable. So you just send your submission as an email attachment to brevityblogessays@gmail.com. That'll be in the guidelines. brevityblogessays@gmail.com. Myself, my byline includes my middle initials. So I'm Andrea A. Firth. So website, www.andreafirth.com, email, and feel free to email me, andreafirth@gmail.com. Yeah, so Google Andrea Firth, you'll find me.
And you will also find her on Instagram and Facebook.
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter or X, sorry. And Diablo Writers Workshop. You can find more about me there.
And definitely check that out because Diablo Writers has some really great newsletters. So even if you're not in the area, because you are teaching in the Bay Area, I get the Diablo Writers newsletter and you always have great resources. So it's something you can definitely subscribe to. And even if you're not in the area, you will benefit from it. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for being on the podcast today. It is so delightful to talk with you. As always, I am so grateful for your time.
Yeah, a pleasure. And thank you for the invitation.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.